Mai no Teki. Enemy dead ahead. Migi no Teki. Enemy to the right. Idari no Teki. Enemy to the left. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Royal Armies. My name is Keith. One of the people whose job it is to bring the museum to life for you. We have shows like this throughout the day. Some of them will be combat demonstrations like this one. Some of them will be active pieces. Some of them will be talks. But the basic idea is the same, that at the end of it, you get the chance to come up and ask questions and handle at least some of the objects that we've been using. So what I just showed you were 3 kata, or sword practice forms from a Japanese martial art called Batto Jutsu. And Batto was a samurai art. The samurai were the medieval warrior knights of Japan, and Batto was the way they trained themselves to draw their wickedly sharp swords from their scabbards and slice their opponents in what appeared to be a single fast motion, which actually was, and is, if you study it today, 2 distinctly separate motions, and we'll come back to why that's important in just a moment. So this is a training version of a katana, the best known of all the Japanese battle swords. And it's a sword that has a completely blunt back edge, but a razor-sharp cutting edge. And that edge is so sharp that a person who knows what they're doing can slice off an arm, a leg, take off a head. It's a very, very dangerous weapon. And because of that, if all you do when you try and draw this sword is to grab hold of the scabbard, grab hold of the sword, give it a yank, and at any point that razor-sharp edge comes into contact with the scabbard, it will slice right through the scabbard and right through your hand as well. You'll do yourself a lot more damage than the enemy. So the trick is to make sure that you can draw it and put it away without hurting yourself. And in fact, I slightly messed up on that last kata that I showed you there. Sometimes you just get a bit tired at the end of a week. It's my Friday on a Saturday. Nothing that actually would have hurt me, but certainly something that makes you go, whoa, 1 more centimetre there, and I could have made a mistake. So it's very, very important to understand what you're doing to minimise that kind of risk. So how do you minimise the risk? Well, by studying waza. And waza are individual techniques that you go through over and over. And when you put a whole series of waza together, that's when you wind up with a kata. So what I'd like to do now is to run through the first of the kata that I showed you, Mai no Teki, and break it down into its component waza. So Mai in Japanese means right in front of you. Teki is the Japanese word for enemy. And so you're saying the enemy is dead ahead. Now, when you're going to practice a kata, what you must always try to do at the beginning, what you're trained to do, is to relax mentally and physically. Now, obviously, you wouldn't stand there like this when your life was threatened in a real fight. But the point is to try and train you to relax as much as possible so that you don't panic if you are in a life or death encounter. You imagine that you see your enemy coming at you and your left hand comes up to grasp the sword and the scabbard. You do that with 4 fingers around the scabbard, the thumb curled around the guard of the sword. And this is a very important position in Japanese swordsmanship because it's a position that a warrior would carry his sword in if he was walking around and he wasn't absolutely sure that he was safe. So the thinking behind this is that I'm sure you're a lovely audience. You can probably imagine we get some very strange people in this museum sometimes. People who are obsessed with weapons. People who think it's really great to be able to get their hands on swords and guns. And sometimes you have to be a little bit careful. And if I was walking around now, one of you got a bit too enthusiastic and leapt up and said, "Come on, Keith, give us a look at your sword." If I've got my thumb over the top of the guard, you can't pull the sword out of the scabbard, and you can't pull the sword and the scabbard out of the sash that goes around my waist. So it's an important at-ready position. Once you've got here, the draw and the cut are about to begin, and several things happen in very quick succession. First off, your right leg moves forward to intercept the enemy. There's very little going backwards in Japanese swordsmanship. It's almost all about closing the distance and striking your enemy on the way in. At the same time, your left hand puts a bit of downward pressure on the sword to feed it into the upcoming right hand. So we get this position. But one final thing happens, and that's that your thumb slips off the guard from being on the top to being slightly behind and to the right. And this is also very important because the Japanese sword is designed to stick in the scabbard. There's a brass collar here called a habaki that's on the sword blade deliberately for that purpose. When the habaki comes loose, you need to change the scabbard. Because if you think about it, you don't want the sword to fall out if you bend over. If you're a dumb samurai and you trip over your own feet, you don't want the sword to go flying down the street and take out half a dozen people. So it's very important the sword always stays in there, even if your hands aren't in contact with it. But sometimes what happens is the sword gets stuck really tightly in the scabbard, and what that would mean is if you simply grasp the scabbard, grasp the sword and pulled, and the moment your life depended on it, the sword didn't come out of the scabbard, you'd be in a lot of trouble because your opponent would step in and thank you very much, boom, and that would be the end of you. So you need to make sure that the sword is going to leave the scabbard as you begin the draw. And that's why your thumb's here, because the very beginning of the draw is going to be your thumb pushing the sword loose. So then we said, seems like one move, it's actually 2. Why? Because in Japanese swordsmanship, you're generally taught to think about drawing the sword by pushing it forward as far as you can and getting used to keeping the back of the sword glued to the back of the scabbard. That way there's much less chance of jumping the scabbard and risk slicing through and hurting you. Now, of course, regardless of how you're moving forward, you'll reach a point where you can't pull the sword out anymore from the scabbard. So what you do then is something called seiyabiki, which is where you draw the scabbard back. So you draw the scabbard back, the sword leaves the scabbard, and then you make your attack. What sometimes happens is that people push the sword forward on one angle, but they pull the scabbard back on another angle. And if you do that, once again, you can cut through the scabbard and into your hand. And that usually happens when people are so keen on making the cut, they forget to do the draw and the seiyabiki properly. So it's very, very important that those two remain separated in your mind, even though they wind up appearing to be a single action. So, when we do this, then, we are going to make a cut, and that is going to be our first waza. And it's called nukitsuki in Japanese. So as we get to here, we draw and cut. Now, what have we done with that cut? Well, we may have beaten our opponent's weapon aside, we may have cut their sword arm, we may have cut their body if their sword arm's still in the air, or, of course, we may have missed. Now, if we miss and we allow our sword to fly out of line like we just did, wonderful for our enemy, this space is open, he steps in and boom, you've had it. So always behooves us to break the cut at the end. So we generally cut and we bring the sword into this finishing position, with the lower part of the blade and the point still threatening the enemy. Because now we still dominate this space in front of us, and we've got a chance of moving in for a second attack. And that second attack is going to be Kyrianos, a finishing move in case the first attack doesn't work. So from here, you step in, you simply whip the sword round your head and make a second cut. 1, 2. Now hopefully that second cut finishes the job. Your opponent is a heap on the floor, but we don't know there are other attackers who might be coming at us, so immediately we dispatch this character, we bring the sword up into the mid-level guard, Chudan. Because from here we can react to the right, to the left, even behind us, if we sense there's danger there. And if this character does start to twitch, well, it's an easy job to finish that job down there. But let's assume that there is no more danger. As far as we can tell, we're in Chudan. We now want to put the sword away. We've got one different kind of problem now. I've hit this poor devil once, twice, maybe 3 times with my razor-sharp katana. It's now covered in what I will euphemistically call raspberry jam. And if we don't clean the raspberry jam off the sword before we shove it back in the scabbard, it's going to be just like raspberry jam. It's going to goo up the sword, and if we're attacked a few yards down the road, we're not going to be able to do another fast draw. Plus which, we're going to ruin the scabbard and ruin the sword blade. So we need to get the raspberry jam off, and we get the worst of it off with a move called Chiburi, which means almost literally life essence flicking in Japanese. And it's done very differently in different schools. In the school that I've studied, it's a simple snap to the right of the arm, thus, and the raspberry jam goes all over you, and it doesn't go all over me. Now, of course, that wouldn't completely clean the blade, but what we would do now is take out a cloth or some absorbent paper, which we always carry on us, and then we would clean the blade thoroughly before we put it away. You never put a samurai sword back in its scabbard unless you thoroughly clean it. So we don't worry about the last bit in kata, we just go with shiburi. Now finally we come to noto, putting the sword away. You've probably worked out for yourselves, it's got a razor-sharp blade, it's also got a pin-sharp point. So do you really want to put a sword like this away by going... Because you're going to stick it through your hand sooner or later. So you don't want to do that. But there's also the question of those other assassins that might be lying in wait. They may not have taken a chance before, but the minute they see you start mucking around like this, hey, boom, they're going to come in and try and finish you off. So for all sorts of safety reasons, we want to put the sword away without looking down, which sounds terrifying, but we drew it without looking down, so why shouldn't we put it away? As long as we observe some simple safety precautions, and the main one is this blunt back of the blade. What we're going to do is grab the scabbard, this time only with these 3 fingers, the thumb and the forefinger are going to act as a cushion to lay the sword on and draw it back through our hand until it can drop neatly into the scabbard. Now, everything about this move is to do with timing, and that's why I went a bit wrong earlier, because for a moment I lost my timing. I didn't quite get that relationship between laying the sword on my hand and drawing it through. Ideally, what you need to do is flip, lay it on your arm, roughly in line with the radial bone in your forearm, and then, when we said before, drawing is pushing and pulling, putting it away is pulling and then pushing. So we pull, then we push, the point drops into the scabbard, you slide it home, and then you can finish your kata by ceremonially stepping up as you close off that habaki seal, get your thumb back over the top of the guard, give the sword a little salute to say it's been a good sword, it helps you out, and then move back to where you started. So that's noto, the final waza. So when we put all 4 waza together, we get Nukitsuke quickly moving into Kyrianos, covering in Chudan, then cleaning the blade with Chiburi, and finally Noto to put the sword away. Then when you step back, you usually do 2 steps looking down at your fallen opponent, The rest of the steps, imagining you're looking around you till you're back where you started, relax, and move on to the next kata. Now, in terms of teaching you combat moves, it's dead simple. Whip the sword out, cut them twice, put the sword away. When you move on through the kata, they get more and more complex as they prepare you for attacks and defences against opponents coming from different directions. But actually, at the end of the day, Mani no Teki is the most complex kata you ever learn, simply because of all the safety that's involved. It's what primes you for the rest of your life as a swords person. So, to finish off with, what I'm going to do is show you the other 5 kata in the style that I studied. So we've gone through the first 3. Mani no Teki we broke down. Then you saw Migi when he comes at you from the left, and Hidari, from the right, and Hidari when he comes at you from the left. So if we've had attacks coming from the front, left and right, where's the next attack coming from? Yes. And he's behind you. In Japanese is Ushiro no Teki. Zenmen no Teki, more than one enemy coming at you from the front. Ushiro, Mai. Migi, Hidari, Shomen. And finally, Suimonogiri, which is preparation for test cutting. So in Japanese swordsmanship, you start off with single-person kata, like I've showed you this morning. Then you move on to two-person kata, where you work with a partner. You swap attacks and defences. You cut the safety margins down to the absolute minimum, and that teaches you distance and timing. And then finally, they give you a razor-sharp sword, and you get to do some cutting practice. Not, I hasten to add, on a human being in this day and age, but on little bamboo mats, a bit like beach mats. You take 2 or 3 of them, roll them up tightly, tie them off, soak them for a few hours, take them out, drain them for a few hours, pop them on a cutting stand, and then you cut through them until you can make lovely clean cuts that you could put a spirit level on. And when you've got the knack of that, and I'm not too bad at that, you go on to Suimonogiri. And Suimonogiri is where you get maybe half a dozen of the mats, and you put them in a U-shaped holder, one on top of the other, so they're like the wall of a log cabin. And then you try and cut through the whole lot from top to bottom with a single blow. And I keep telling myself, one day I'm going to have enough courage to try it. So Suimonogiri.